The word that Jeremiah the prophet spoke to Baruch the son of Neriah, when he wrote these words in a book at the dictation of Jeremiah, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, to you, O Baruch. You said, Woe is me, for the Lord has added sorrow to my pain. I am weary with my groaning, and I find no rest. Thus shall you say to him, Thus says the Lord, Behold, what I have built, I am breaking down, and what I have planted, I am plucking up, that is, the whole land. And do you seek great things for yourself? Seek them not, for behold, I am bringing disaster upon all flesh, declares the Lord. But I will give you your life as a prize of war in all places to which you may go. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we ask that you would receive our thanks for the gift of life today and for the gift of our friend Lyle Dorsett and the 80 years of life you've given him and the new life in Christ that many have received because you've worked through him. Father, we pray that you would help each one of us to not seek great things for ourselves, to not serve you for what we could get out of it, but rather to be faithful to you because you love us and because we love you. Thank you that you give us so much more than merely our lives. But we thank you for Baruch and Jeremiah and for many of the people that Lyle's written about who have shown us what it means to serve you under difficult circumstances. May we follow their example of faithfulness today. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
So today we're here to interview and spend some time with Lyle Dorsett. Lyle was born in 1938 to Ida and Al Dorsett. He is a Missourian, of which I am as well, and we are grateful for one another. More on his background in a bit. His wife's name is Mary, and many of you have met her, got to know her. As you know, she's been suffering with lung cancer for the last few years, and Lyle and Mary have a long record of serving together in the Lord's work, and we're grateful for her. Their children are Michael, who is a teacher in the Chicago area, and his daughter is Erica, who's with the Lord. Lyle has made a home in many places, including Alabama when he was a kid. So Lyle, I want to start with that. Tell us the places, starting with when you were born. Where has your family homes been? A variety of places.
Yeah, I've lived in a lot of places. People always say, where are you from? And I'm not sure what that means for me. I was born in Kansas City, Missouri side, I'm proud to say. People on the Kansas side were always snooty. They looked down their nose at Missourians. So Paul and I knew how wrong that could be, but we're used to being kicked around. But anyway, that's where I was born, was raised there. And when I was about 13, my father was transferred, maybe I was 12, transferred here to Birmingham. And he was a sales executive with a Butler Manufacturing Company. This used to be a steel manufacturing city, and that's what he was here to be involved with, overseeing the sales in the southeastern part of the U.S. I did not like Birmingham. I was called a Yankee from the minute in fact, there was one chap, I think he's still alive, lives out in Trussville, Travis Glass. Travis used to fight me every day at Robinson Elementary School at the break when we went outside. Travis would say, Yankee, come on over and let's show the people who's the toughest. I went home and said to my dad one day, I said, what am I supposed to say to these people when they keep calling me Yankee? And I heard that incessantly. And Dad said, tell them we kicked the hell out of them in the Civil War and we'll do it again if they don't shut up. And that was my father's rather robust view of approaching things. And I came home with a fat lip and a partially broken nose after that. And I said, Dad, have you got any other approach you might suggest? He said, even Grant lost a few skirmishes, so don't worry about it. Anyway, but I did make some good friends here. My father went back to Kansas City, and I went back there when I was in high school. I went to Woodlawn, went to Robinson Elementary School here, and then went to Woodlawn High School, and played football at Woodlawn, and got badly injured. And I'm so old that we played before there were face masks, and so that was an interesting time. And Birmingham was not a cutting-edge city in those days. It didn't have a great university and medical school here. And I had a bad brain injury from the football, and they had to bring in a brain surgeon from Atlanta to work on me. But today, probably Atlanta would get people out of Birmingham to come. I think the city has changed. But the big thing that happened to me in Birmingham was, as a teen, I was walking home one night. I always had 2 or 3 jobs. My dad always said, nobody's on the dole in this house. And I always had 1 or 2 jobs. And I was walking home from a job, walked across the Howard College campus, which used to be out in Roebuck, East Lake area. And there was a big tent revival meeting going on. I'd never seen anything like that. I was raised in the Lutheran church. And there was a man on a platform. There was a big tent. People gathered in, and he was preaching on the prodigal son. I was outside of that tent and listening, and I had an overwhelming sense that I was that prodigal that he was talking about. I wasn't a particularly errant young man, but I, certainly was a sinner that needed grace. And he invited all the prodigals to come up and give their lives to Christ. I was not in that tent. And feeling always like an outsider here, I was reluctant to go inside the tent when the invitation was offered, because I thought, I don't belong here. And he then went on to say, as he ended the thing, he said, if God gives me another night, I'm coming back here. And I'm going to offer this invitation again. And if he gives you another night and you haven't come forward and you were supposed to, you better do it, because you don't know how long you've got. I was there the next night, and I tentatively went up to the tent and was greatly welcomed, and got into the tent, sat up at the front. When the evangelist, whose name was Eddie Martin, preached, I have no idea what his sermon, what he said in the sermon. I don't know what his text was, but I was waiting for that invitation he promised. I went up and got on my knees. I can still feel my elbows in a bench. And he came down and put his arm around me and prayed through with me and asked me to give my life to Jesus, led me in a sinner's prayer. While that happened, and I don't know what your theological angle of vision would have you to do with this. I'd been baptized a Lutheran. I was confirmed a Lutheran. I'm now on my knees praying at a Baptist revival and sensing that I'm being born again. And during the time he was praying with me, as Zach, it was as clear as I know you're sitting there. I knew Jesus was there, and he was telling me, you're going to preach like this man. I'm calling you to do this work. I didn't know what that meant, and when I got through, the evangelist told me, now you've got to go home and tell your parents what you've done. And then he said, we've got to get you in a church. I said, we're in a church. We're at First Lutheran Church. He said, oh, that doesn't count. They do baptism wrong. So anyway, I went home and told my father, and I thought Dad might get hacked off. He hugged me, and he said, when you were born, we gave you to the Lord, asked the Lord to use you. He said, your mother had 5 miscarriages, and she couldn't have another child. And we said, use him. We give him to you. So he was pleased. They went with me to the Baptist church, and we all 3 got rebaptized. I don't think that's harmed me at all. I think I'm kind of blessed. We moved away 2 or 3 years later back to Kansas City, and I'm not proud to say, I'm very embarrassed to say, but I moved back and I got out of the church environment I was in, and with my friends who were Christians, went back to a high school where a lot of my friends had been, and I fell in with the wrong crowd. We weren't really bad kids, but we drank beer. It was against the law to drink beer till you were 21. We'd go out and drink beer, we'd smoke cigarettes, we'd take our girlfriends and go park. We didn't do bad things, but we'd hiss and drink beer. It wasn't good. It wasn't a good environment. And gradually I discovered these people didn't believe much of anything. Then I went off to college and university. This is just to get down to the point, my professors, almost all of them that I admired, said, if you're an intelligent person who thinks, you're not a Christian. I became an agnostic really because I felt I needed to identify with these people who I figured were smarter than me and a lot of other people. Anyway, I ended up becoming an agnostic. I spent some time in a Marine Reserve unit for some years, and I met a lot of people there. I was nudged back to the faith, though, by a Marine chaplain who really he really helped me at a couple of times. And he had an impact on me that was phenomenal. And somehow I knew God had his hand on me and wasn't going to let me flee too far. There's great security in that finally. But anyway, I went to college, was planning to be a mortician.
Tell us where you went to college, where your academic work was done.
I'm going too slow, aren't I?
A little bit.
Yeah, that's been.
We only have an hour, and I have some other.
Mary always says to me, "Lyle, there's beauty in brevity." If she were here now, she'd be saying that. Sorry. I went off to the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I got a BA there. I got an MA in history, and had some really good professors, and then went on for a PhD at the University of Missouri in Columbia.
Right. So by that time, you're really not identifying your life as a Christian.
Not at all.
It's in the past. Yeah.
Not at all.
And so, tell me and the group, why did you get interested in academic work? What was the spark for that?
The spark for that was a professor. I had to take American history class, a year of American history in the community college I went to first. I didn't want to take it. I had to take it. It was required. I tried to get out of it. The dean wouldn't allow it. The professor walked in the first day, set down his briefcase, and he said, most of you are here because you're required to take this course. He said, that's one of many significant differences between us. He said, I'm here because I love history, and I'm glad. He said, I could do other things, but I teach this because I love it. And if you'll give me a chance and meet me halfway, I'll bring history alive to you. I remember thinking, you're on, Jack. I like that challenge. And I fell in love with history, and I changed my major to history, and got a BA in history, and went on and got an MA, and then on for a PhD. I had a professor that took me under wing my junior and senior year as a history major, and then led me in the MA and my master's thesis. That was the one that really got me into committing to going into history to get a PhD and to teach. He had a great influence on me.
And you wrote on Harry Truman and his relationship with the Pendergast machine, didn't you? Or was that your first book?
Well, my first book was on the Pendergast political machine. It's called the Pendergast machine. It was a political boss overseeing a city, Kansas City. And that machine elevated Harry Truman to the Senate, which then got him to ended up becoming he was a senator and then vice president and ended up being president. I interviewed Truman when I did research on him. That was very helpful. And
what was Harry Truman was president of the United States and the best and only president from Missouri that we've had. So, what was Truman like?
Truman was acerbic. He was very unfriendly to me, but he did help me. When I went to interview him, he said, "Why do you want to interview me? Haven't you read my memoirs?" He's got a 2-volume memoir. I said, "Yes, sir, I have." He said, "Well, everything is in the memoirs." And I said, "Well, sir, if you don't mind, I got a few questions that I don't think have been raised in there." And then he would condescendingly answer my questions. He would cut me pretty short. He was not friendly. I was looking forward to meeting him. I'm glad I met him. He was, I don't believe he was a corrupt politician. He was very honest. But I wrote a history of the Pendergast machine. He was involved in it. And that was my PhD dissertation. By the grace of God, I can see now, it was published soon after I wrote the dissertation. And that sort of launched my career. It was published with a good publisher. It was Oxford University Press. And in those days, to get a book with a publisher like that early on just opened doors for you. And there were not many professors. There were more openings than there were professors in some of the universities. And the fact that I had that book got me job offers and light teaching loads and grants that enabled me to keep writing. So it's a time quite different from today. I don't pat myself on the back for any of this. I was very fortunate to live when I did.
Baby boom was a different time, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Now, what was your first teaching hour? Is it University of Southern California? Is that where you
No, I taught for 1 year at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and then left there and went to the University of Southern California where I taught. And I loved teaching out there, but I hated Los Angeles. The smog got to me, the traffic on the freeway was horrid, and I got fished back to the University of Missouri St. Louis after that and went back there. So I went there and taught there, and then eventually moved to the University of Colorado in Boulder, University of Denver. Then went to Wheaton College after I became a Christian, and now I came here.
All right. And we'll get back to some of those events. Now, you at University of Colorado, University of Denver, and that's a key moment. That's a key place in your life. Before you talk about that, you wrote histories of two cities, didn't you? Of Kansas City, Missouri, and Denver. Was that correct?
I've always liked biography. I love biography, and my MA thesis was a biography, and my PhD dissertation was primarily biographical. But I thought, cities have lives too. They're birthed, they grow, they reach maturity. Some of them even die. So I decided, I think I'll write an urban biography. So I wrote a history of Kansas City, Missouri, a city that I knew well. Then when I moved to teach in Colorado, and I was asked to teach a history of Colorado, I realized there wasn't a decent history of Denver, which was such a major part of that state. So I decided to write a history of Denver. And I was fortunate enough to get a grant and get some time to do it. And I love those urban biographies, and actually started a series of urban biographies. Other people did other cities.
So what do you even today say, I'm glad I learned, it helps me in my life now from writing about these great cities and their history?
Well, one of the things I learned is that so many people who don't care about history or don't read it or look at it sort of think we live as if everything has just happened now. But to see the process, the issues and change over time. What we live in Birmingham, Alabama today. What we experience in this city has roots that go way back. Some of them good, some of them bad. But we're part of a process. And I like to see that. I have found it enriching just to understand that a little better.
And does it help you minister to people where they are, you think?
It does indeed. And I think studying history, I'll give you an example. I'm an Anglican. That's often associated with the Episcopal Church. In fact, the Episcopal Church USA is one of the Anglican, it's part of the International Anglican Communion. But as an historian, I know that historically, especially in the South, only the wealthy people were Episcopalians. The poorer people were Baptists and Methodists. And for one thing, and so consequently, I knew that if you go to an Episcopal church, many people view you as somebody that doesn't care about the people. They view, you're an Episcopalian, I know that isn't true, but the point, you know what these images are. And these images grow out of history.
And some of those images are true.
Some of them are true.
In some cases, aren't they?
And the truth was, the Episcopalians, when the South opened up after the War of 1812, they didn't go out and plant churches. They didn't want to, historians used to laugh and say they didn't want to get their silk stockings snagged on the briars and brambles. So they stayed on the Atlantic seaboard, the Carolinas, Virginia, and so forth. But you come westward, and who packs up and plants a church, a horseback ride apart? The Methodists and the Baptists. They go out and did it. The Presbyterians got better about it and got in on it. But it was, again, history helps you see that and helps you understand why people view certain denominations the way they view them today. You can't escape that.
Now, and I will add that if you get the Episcopalians in the right century, right after the Revolutionary War, you might imagine the Church of England not real popular in the U.S. I believe in Virginia there were 7 ministers and 19 congregates, and from that, as they began to go out and do ministry, that's so in a different century,
Yeah.
a different approach. Well, all right, Lyle. So now, this stage of your story, you're in University of Colorado and University of Denver. You're successful, tenured, I assume, well published. Your career's going well, but seems like your faith, as far as that goes, it's a mess, right? And could you tell us a little bit about, because in true Wesleyan fashion, you talk about this experience you had here in Birmingham, and you said born again, and I've often heard you talk about what you're going to describe next as when you were converted. And so a Wesleyan can say both those things are true. So tell us about what happened to you, in Colorado, how you came back to the Lord or came to the Lord for the first time.
Well, my wife was raised Roman Catholic, and she was in Catholic schools through 2 years of university even, and then she went to the University of Missouri. She says maybe she was told about grace, but she never heard it. And she lived under a legalism, and she was pretty confident she was on her way to hell. She met me and married me, and her parents were confident she was going to go to hell, that she married a pagan like Lyle Dorsett. 2 years after we were married, and we were living in Boulder, Colorado, and my wife said, I want to go to church. We got married. She said, we need church to, sort of as a glue for our marriage. I said, okay, fine. We went to church, and she said, we got married in 1970. She said, I don't want to go to a church where the pastor wears a leisure suit and a string tie. She said, I want to see some vestments. And I said, well, we're not going back to the Catholic Church. They don't want you, and I don't want to be a Catholic. I said, why don't we go to the Lutheran Church? They have everything but smells and bells. I think you'll find things. They have communion every Sunday. You'll see vestments. We went to the Lutheran Church in Boulder. Mary thought it looked right. The liturgy was very similar. We had Holy Communion. And that pastor taught her about grace. And I remember the day she broke down and wept and said, I'm saved by grace. She was so thrilled about it. And she did a 180. And she didn't want to spend money on the same things. Her life changed, and I watched her change. And she was praying for me because she knew I was lost. And then a student at the University of Denver. I got to tell you about this student. And I tell you this because students can have a profound impact on somebody. I've always learned from my students wherever I've been. But this student, Lauren Pfister, was a history major. People used to kid him that he was majoring in Lyle Dorsett because he took every course, all the electives he could get in history. Pfister was in there. He'd sit on the front row. He was brilliant. He was an outstanding student, but he had one kind of weird side. He was a Christian. One day I walked in, he's sitting in class early, it was an 8 a.m. class, and he's reading this book, and I looked at it, I said, what is this? He said, well, this is my New Testament in Koine Greek. I said, Greek? What are you reading that for? He said, oh, well, as soon as I graduate, I'm going down to Denver Seminary. It was then Conservative Baptist Seminary. He said, because I'm going to go into the ministry, and I need to study Greek, and I'm working on it now. I said, Lauren, don't throw your life away. You're brilliant. Be an historian. Get a PhD in history. He said, oh, no, sir. I got the highest calling in the world. The Lord's called me to preach, to be a missionary. Well, I admired this kid. And one day he comes up to me after class. And this is where you can have an impact if you're good at what you're doing and you confront somebody. He said, sir, did I understand you today to tell me You said intelligent people are not Christians? I said, no, Lauren. I said intelligent, reflective people are not Christians. And he stood, he was kind of like Columbo, that detective. He stood up, he said, oh, thank you, sir. And he starts walking off. Then he gets the door and he turns around. Oh, by the way, sir, have you ever read any books by G.K. Chesterton? I said, no. How about C.S. Lewis? I said, no. A few days later, he comes in. He's got a copy of Chesterton's Orthodoxy. He hands it to me. He said, sir, I challenge you to read this book to examine a different worldview. I said, Lauren, I'm not going to borrow your book because I'm not a dilettante. I got piles of books I got to read. I said, I don't have time, and I'll put it on my desk and never get it back. He said, sir, I bought it for you. I'm giving this book to you. This stirred me because Lauren had faded blue jeans when they weren't fashionable. He had shirts that were always clean, but they were frayed at the collar and cuff. He carried his lunch in a brown paper sack. No cool person did that. Lauren had 3 jobs, and he bought me a book. That so touched me that I dropped it in my briefcase. I got home that night, pulled that little paperback out. He writes his name to Dr. Dorsett with whatever, and then he says, blessings, Lauren Pfister. And then he has this. And he's got this doodling under it. I said, Lauren, what's it? Because I took that book home and read it that night. It's a very short book. I didn't remember hardly anything in it or understand anything except one phrase that said this. One phrase in that book. Chesterton said, after I became a Christian, I understood why I've always been homesick at home. I thought, man, that's me. This guy's reading my mail. I've always been homesick at home. I was jumping around from university to university because I was trying to find a good place to live. I said, Lauren, that's neat, and I thank you for that. What's this doodling under your... Oh, sir, I'm glad you asked me that. He said, this is the cross they crucified our Lord Jesus on. That's the grave they put him in. He said 3 days later, he walked right out of there. He said, sir, you need to understand that. I said, Lauren, I'm sorry I ever asked you. But he laughed. He prayed for me. And then my radio in my car broke and was stuck on a gospel station, KPOF. If you met this in a novel, you wouldn't like it. You'd say it's contrived. I had a VW Beetle and a radio that had push buttons. They broke, and it was stuck on one station, which was KPOF, the Pillar of Fire station. I had it on because they played classical music every afternoon, and they did the news, first-rate news, at the head of every hour. So that's why I had it on there, but I couldn't move it. And I couldn't stand to be alone. I'd be in my car traveling 26 miles each way, commuting from Boulder to Denver, and I'm having to listen to stories of great Christians. Biographical sketches of stories of great Christians. Again, you wouldn't like it in the novel, but it happened. One night I pulled off and went up to that gospel station, rang the bell. The man who directed it opened the door and he said, what can I do for you? I said, I'm a prof down at the University of Denver. I'm listening to your radio. I'd just like to talk to you about what you believe. I didn't surrender to Christ that night, but this guy gave me an hour. And the hound of heaven was after me. A student reading Chesterton and on, all this stuff. And then a praying wife. A praying wife. It's enough to make a Calvinist out of you, you know.
So you're back with the Lord now, and you and Mary are serving God together. You start thinking about ministry, but you also then begin writing about and interested in C.S. Lewis, Joy Davidman, his wife. This is the early 80s now, right? And you receive a call to Wheaton College, as you said. You spent 23 years there where we met. I want you to tell the class about the original research that you did, the primary source work that you did to be able to write about C.S. Lewis. because I think it gets a little bit to your heart as a person, as a Christian, as a scholar. I think this book, and God Came In, you said something like 95% of it was new work that had been found. So tell the group, you got to know Lewis's stepsons and who else?
Eventually, I really need to say that after I surrendered my life to Christ, I felt increasingly called to, I didn't feel that I should stop writing, but I wanted to write some different things, maybe some things that might help build the kingdom rather than just say another urban biography or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And I prayed and prayed, and the Lord, virtually a book jutted out of my bookshelf. My wife had picked up a copy of a book entitled Smoke on the Mountain by Joy Davidman. She'd bought it for me for $1, and one night I was sitting there with my dog and watching the fire go down. Mary and the kids had gone to bed, and I pulled that book off the shelf, and it had a picture of the woman on the back. It just said Joy Davidman, and it was a Jewish Christian's interpretation of the Ten Commandments. It's not a big book. I just read through it that night. It was an easy read, but a very interesting read. The next morning I said to Mary, I read that book you bought me, and that woman's interesting. And I said, I looked up the Hooper Green biography, and she's only given a paragraph in there, but she married C.S. Lewis. I said, but she's only got a paragraph in the book. And she said, well, maybe you ought to write a biography of her then. I said, yeah, I think I will. Long story short, I managed to find Joy Davidman's papers. And then I interviewed people that knew her, including her brother and her first cousin. And that book, I went to Wheaton. They didn't have any of her things. But because I wrote that book, they asked me to come out. I got her stepsons, got one of them there for several days. We did a video oral history interview. And by the time we left, she said that Marjorie Mead, who directed the Wade Center, the C.S. Lewis collection, said, this oral history stuff you're into, and I'd done a lot of that, she said, we need to get all the people that knew C.S. Lewis before they die. And I said, yeah, you do. You better get some money and get that project going. A week later, I get a call and say, we want to hire you to come to direct the Marion E. Wade Center and oversee. I did 50 to 60 oral history interviews in the wake of that. And God gave me a dear woman, Frank, you might know her, Carol Kraft, who taught German at Wheaton. She was independently wealthy. She underwrote for me and Mary to go together every summer to the UK, and we interviewed 50 to 60 people. You know, God just kept opening these doors. And it was a wonderful thing. And that one book then led me, I wanted to write a spiritual biography of C.S. Lewis. I was tired of reading biographies that said the great, brilliant man did all these things. He gets converted, and then he's this great Christian, as if he was birthed into full maturity. Well, people aren't that way. You come to Christ, you have to grow in the faith like you had to grow physically after you were born. So I decided I wanted to do a book that showed how C.S. Lewis grew spiritually and what were the elements involved in his life. And so that was a lot of fun.
And I guess what I'm trying to stress here is that you weren't just reading secondary and tertiary sources on these people's lives and restitching it together to try to get a new book. You were doing primary resource with people who knew him, with his family members who could speak about his growth as it actually happened. Same thing with his wife. I was interested to reread your acknowledgments there and see that you'd even found her first husband's widow and gotten his papers. So it's you really went to a lot of trouble to do upfront, fresh history.
Right.
And I think that's to be commended. I know a lot of people here are interested in history and doctrine and stuff. I've always said when I introduced Lyle's a real historian. And by that I mean the greatest respect, that he digs into the sources, he takes the time to meet the people, find the letters, write the documents, and so it is fresh. So your Lewis books and David books, but you also wrote about D.L. Moody. I think that's the first book of yours I ever read, actually, and Billy Sunday. When did you write the Moody biography? And were you in Chicago then? And did you do some primary research there?
We
as
were
well?
living in Wheaton, and I spent an entire summer at the Moody Bible Institute. That Moody asked me to write the biography. They wanted a biography written of Moody, but they didn't want a Moody insider. They wanted somebody that was an historian that liked and respected evangelists, but wasn't one of their people. And Joe Stoll, who was president there at the time, called me and asked me if I would do that book. And I said, well, if I can get a sabbatical leave, I was applying for one for the next year. I said, I'll do it. But God will show me whether or not I get the sabbatical leave, which I did. And then they gave me the money to have a graduate student at Moody photocopy all of his papers. So I lugged it. My wife started a mission to impoverished children in Mexico. I took boxes of Moody's letters, photocopied, and took them down there. And I sat in a room 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, and sorted this stuff chronologically and did a lot of thinking, a lot of praying, and wrote the biography that way.
For those who just know Moody as some name out there on a college, give us about a paragraph on the extraordinary influence that Moody had, and what he was absolutely that day's Billy Graham, wasn't he? Give us an idea.
He was a phenomenal evangelist. He had maybe he might have had a fourth grade education. He was very ignorant. He was extremely poor. But God got his hand on that man. I mean, God selected him and called him out and set him apart to do the work of an evangelist. And he was the most powerful evangelist, certainly in the English-speaking world, in his era, in the late 19th century. Moody is an example of a man who had no advantages. His father died soon after he was born. He was sent off to a farm, he and his brother, to work. Mom couldn't keep him. He never once played the victim. I can't find in a letter, I can't find in a sermon where he talked about all the disadvantage, how poor he was an orphan, and on and on. He refused to play the victim. Instead, he kept thanking God for the things he had. My mother loved me. This family took me all and on. There's a lesson. Studying his life awakened me to some of my darkness.
Well, it's interesting because he was in Chicago. I think one of the great scenes in your books where you describe how Moody rose out into Lake Michigan to watch the city of Chicago burn. 1876, was that? But he was really kind of pioneer in mass evangelism in big cities. And you had this interest in urban places. You've been doing this work. And then did you write the book about Billy Sunday because of that interest in urban
I wrote the biography of Billy Sunday because I was asked to write it for a series. There was a series of Christian biographies, and I was asked to write the book. And I wrote it. I'm glad I did, but I did learn a lesson there for those of you that want to write. The books I've enjoyed most, and I think are better books of those I've written, are the ones I chose to write because I was excited about the topic. When I've written a couple of books where I was asked to do them. I got them done, they're okay, but there wasn't any passion in them. It wasn't a burning thing. I got to tell the story. When I wrote the biography of Joy Davidman, it was like she grabbed me by the clavicles and shook me and said, "Tell my story, tell my story." The same with Moody. But with Billy Sunday, it was fine. It opened some doors for me. I'm glad I did it. But it was a different thing.
Yeah, and Sunday also did mass evangelism. It's fair to say, isn't it, that Billy Graham really learned from and copied a lot of the methods of Billy Sunday and D.L. Moody?
Billy Graham had the wisdom to go talk to Mrs. Sunday and said, "Help me, I'm beginning to have a ministry that's growing as a preaching evangelist, an itinerating evangelist, and what can you tell me to help me learn?" She said, "Billy and I made a huge mistake. We never took a salary. We didn't have an association, and we just received a love offering at the end of a week or month's series. And she said, we had no one hold us accountable for the money. She said, we did nothing wrong, but it brought a lot of ill repute to the name of the Lord. And she said, Mr. Graham, if you're wise, you'll get a committee and you will not touch any offerings that come. You'll have them get the money and give you a salary and expenses. And you'll never take gifts from people. Be very careful. And he did, and he gave Moss Sunday, is what they called her, all the credit for that. Billy had people always wanted to buy him a new car. Somebody wanted to buy him a Mercedes or wanted to buy him at least a new Pontiac. He wouldn't take anything. He drove an old car. He would never take, he had a salary and it was always very modest. And he learned that from the mistakes that Billy Sunday made, who didn't know any better. So he was always learning that way.
What did Mrs. Sunday tell Billy Graham about the Sunday children?
She said that we ruined our children. She said Billy was gone all the time and wasn't there to take care of the children. They had, the oldest child was a daughter. She turned out well. The boys were both alcoholics. One of them definitely killed himself. It might be that the other one did. And she said Billy was gone all the time. He was so homesick for me that he insisted I travel with him. She said I was torn in two. I wanted to be with him and be with the children, but I'd go with him. And she said, we think we wrecked our kids because then we spoiled them to make up for the fact we weren't there. We bought them cars, we gave them money, we gave them all. She said we wrecked them. It was sad, very sad.
So you've been writing about D.L. Moody, Billy Sunday, C.S. Lewis, in their own ways, very effective evangelists in a lot of different ways. You also got to know a fellow named Malcolm Muggeridge awfully well, and I'd be curious if this age people even know who that is, and if so, I'd like you again give him a thumbnail sketch of Muggeridge and how you got to know him and what that's meant to you.
Malcolm Muggeridge was a television journalist, and he had a program that aired every week in England, BBC television, called Panorama, and he had various topics he would do each week, and he decided, and he was baptized and confirmed in the Anglican Church. He was an Englishman, grew up, but he was an atheist, he said, by the time he was doing this work. Anyway, he wanted to do a series, he wanted to do an evening on his show of Mother Teresa. So he packs up some photographers, and they go down and they make an appointment to see Mother Teresa, and she's making a name for herself, caring for the destitute, dying. They interview her and talk to her, and they get ready to take a tour of her home for the destitute, dying. They get up to the door, she opens the door, and the cameramen start getting their lights out. And she said, "You're not turning any lights on in here. These are dying people." She had them all over the floor on pallets. She said, "We're not going to disturb them." And Muggeridge said, "Mother T, I've come all the way from London to do this series on you. Now you let me turn these lights on, because I can put on a show on Panorama that's going to raise money for you. So you just back off of that." She said, "Mr. Muggeridge, I want to tell you something. God will take care of my ministry. I don't need your money. And I'm not doing that to these people." And she said, "If you don't want to do it, it's too bad." And he said to the cameraman, "Let's go ahead and walk through." And they said, "The lighting is impossible. We can't do it." They went ahead, walked with her. She took them through. That evening, they got together, and the cameramen all said, "This will be worthless." He said it was as if the lighting was absolutely perfect. And he said, "At that moment, I knew that God was in that place." He said it took something supernatural to give the lighting to this dark place so we could have all this footage. And Mary, my dear wife Mary, became the archivist at Wheaton College, and among the papers she got, which Frederick Buechner, the novelist, got his papers, she got Malcolm Muggeridge's papers. And we spent part of 5 summers there with her interviewing him and sorting his papers. And I learned a lot from this dear man. He was a committed Christian. I want to tell you one thing that's interesting, because I think it'll help you, and it's in the spirit of this school, Beeson. On the mantle of the fireplace of the Muggeridges, he had a picture of Mother Teresa, and she'd autographed it. Next to it was a picture of one of the Booth women, I've forgotten her first name, who at that time was the head of the Salvation Army. Now, Mother Teresa's a Catholic. The other woman's Salvation Army. You can't get much lower in high church, if you understand. They're both there on the mantle. So I just said, Mr. Muggeridge, this is interesting. You have the pictures of these two women. And I said, you have a daughter who's in the Dutch Reformed Church. You have a son up in northern England who's in the Conservative Brethren Church. You have a son who's a Roman Catholic. What do you do with all these traditions? And he looked at me like I was some sort of an oaf. And he said, well, different regiments of the same army, my man. I like that. To me, that's Beeson. Presbyterians, Anglicans, Baptists, AME, different regiments of the same. That's good stuff, isn't it? See, that's what you pick up along the way from these people.
Muggeridge was really a celebrity Christian in the 80s, 90s. And I mean, he was interviewed on Bill Buckley's national program. He wrote a book called Jesus Rediscovered, because Muggeridge he'd been posted in the Soviet Union in the 30s and had become disillusioned with the communist regime and all that. So he was a rather well-known Christian. So you become a pastor in Wheaton. I know there's a long lead up to that, but a lot of people who are of my generation or after would say I first knew of Lyle Dorsett as a pastor of an Anglican church in Wheaton, Illinois. How'd that come about?
Well, it actually started in Colorado. 2 years after the Lord liberated me, I was born again because of all the prayers of people, and I was an alcoholic, and God freed me. 2 years later, God called me to the ministry. And I tried to get ordained in the Methodist Church. In fact, I enrolled at the Iliff School of Theology, and my wife and I both wanted to get in the Methodist Church. And the Methodist Church is pretty good here in the Southeast, but I can tell you in Colorado in those days, it was a heretical denomination. We weren't even allowed to refer to God as He. We couldn't refer to Jesus as He. And I tried to hang in with that, and they also told me, my district superintendent said, if I ever hear any more of this doctrine of hell from you, we're not going to ordain you. And so what are we going to do? And anyway, long story short, I did a week-long revival at an independent church in the eastern plains of Colorado. And the pastor of that church I'd gotten to know, and he knew that I had been very disappointed that I couldn't continue to pursue ordination in the Methodist Church. And they had in those days what they called the old man's canon. You didn't have to go all the way through a seminary degree. If you could get some courses that they required, and if you could pass the general ordination exams, they'd ordain you. So that was my approach. And I never intended even to get an MDiv. I intended to take enough classes to meet the requirements. But I was lost. I'm doing this series, and this pastor said to me, we know you're so disappointed, and we know you're getting ready to move to Wheaton, Illinois, but we'd be happy to ordain you. Now, this was a little independent church on the eastern plains of Colorado in a little town called Dacono. He said, we'd be happy to ordain you, but you probably wouldn't think that was real ordination. I wept. They ordained me 2 weeks later, and I still see that as my ordination because I know God was in it. I went on and was ordained in the Anglican Church. I had to jump through some new hoops and do a few things, but that's okay. I've been baptized twice, so I think, be ordained twice, hey, great. That was sort of the way I saw it.
You take the Lord's Supper every week. So.
Yeah. So anyway, that was...
Well, so you were pastoring Wheaton, and then I think for
we started an independent church, became an Anglican church.
Right, and now I think for time's sake, so I want to leave some time for student questions if there are any. You and I always have more to talk about. So you were as I recall, when we were colleagues at Wheaton, 2001 to 2004, you were wrapping up that work at the church.
Mm-hmm.
Do I recall correctly, they gave you a gift of a 1944 Army Jeep?
They gave me a 1944 Willys Jeep because I never took a salary from the church. They wanted to do something for me. So they gave me a World War II Jeep.
Yeah, and we won't go into his World War II collection because you can go see that at the house, and it's extraordinary, a museum. But I remember that bit, and you were still teaching, and Lyle was a very popular teacher at Wheaton. I often run into students from there who say, well, if you see Lyle Dorsett, they, tell him we said hello. And then I have to go back and find out who they are. But you decided then to step down from the church, and you accepted the call of Beeson. Tell us a little bit about why you came to Beeson. Because you were about, I mean, obviously we've already done the numbers. You were your retirement age then. By some people's standards, 66 or so.
Yeah, well, we didn't, Paul was packing up his books to move here to Beeson, and I went down to his office and said, I'm going to miss you. And he was one of the solid guys in the Bible department and a friend, and he said, well, he said, did you hear Louis Drummond died, the Billy Graham professor at Beeson? I said, I heard that. He said, well, I'd like to put your name in for that. Would you be interested? I said, I'd be very interested because I was ready to leave Wheaton, and the reason I was ready to leave Wheaton, and I don't want to be slamming somebody else, but the point was that there was a liberal trend developing in the Bible theology department and then in other departments, which I found very uncomfortable. And I'd already said to Mary, I've signed a contract for next year, but I'm not staying here. I just can't in good conscience do it. And I wasn't sure what I would do. I was thinking about going to work for the C.S. Lewis Institute or something like that. And Paul said, could I throw your name in? And I said, well, you sure can. I said, but I don't think Mary will want to leave because we had a wonderful church that we were pastoring there in Wheaton, and we had our only living child and 4 grandkids. And I said, I don't think Mary will want to move. Paul said, well, you can pray, can't you? So I went home and told Mary that Paul said he was going to throw my name in at Beeson. She said, well, that's kind, but I don't want to move. And I said, well, Paul said maybe we could pray about it. She said, I have prayed and we're not moving. God doesn't want us to. And Dr. Thielman and his wife took us to dinner one night while we were still there. And those of you who have met Abby Thielman know she's a wonderful woman. And anyway, Frank and Abby took us to dinner. And Mary left that dinner and said, she just broke down and cried in the motel. I said, I'm not going to do this to you. I'm not going to crucify you on a cross of my career. And she said, no, let me grieve. You're going to get the offer, and now I know we're supposed to go. So I'm forever in debt to the Thielman family because that dinner that night, and I think you even bought it, and everything came out great, but it was... And Mary, I heard her on the phone. We'd been here a couple of years, and I heard her one day talking to somebody. I wasn't eavesdropping, but I heard the conversation. Somebody was saying, does Lyle like it at Beeson? She said, does he like it? She said, he's never once come home complaining about the faculty, the staff, the students, anybody. She says, he loves the place. And she said, I'm so glad we came.